The FDA is cracking down on off-brand weight loss drugs similar to Ozempic. A previous loophole allowed companies to offer alternatives, but that's now over. First Alert 6's Philip Katafamo spoke with an expert about what you can expect when it comes to treatment.
GLP-1 drugs for weight loss like Ozempic and Wegovy were previously in a shortage.
But there is a loophole where medications are under shortage. Generally, there is an allowance for production of essential copies of those medications.
During that time, compounding pharmacies were allowed to sell replica products to make up for low supply. However, in February, the FDA declared the shortage of semaglutide and tirzepatide over, meaning the loophole is closed and enforcement is underway.
The FDA did give that significant lead time in advance of the date that they would start enforcing those violations of those regulations, but that final date of not enforcing those was yesterday.
Dr. Johnson Rabbit says that FDA regulation is important when determining a medication as safe and effective.
Making sure that, batch to batch, that they're the same, et cetera, that, if a dose is labeled as a dose, it is that dose, especially with the GLP-1 type medications. People can be doing very well on one dose, but could get very, very, very ill if they got a different dose, a significantly higher dose.
Experts say thousands or maybe millions relied on compounded GLP-1 meds due to their cheaper cost. Dr. Johnson Rabbit has concerns when it comes to seeking this kind of treatment.
Well, with compounded medications, some of the concerns are quality problems like contamination with other substances or too much or too little active ingredient. And as such, really significant concerns about patient safety.
She worries folks could seek medication alternatives online.
There are known concerns about, even outside of specifically compounding, even things that are meant to be used in laboratory settings and things like that being made available, as well as even counterfeit medications that look like, a pen of a labeled medication, but are not, unfortunately.
Dr. Johnson Rabbit is optimistic another shortage won't happen, but
there's nothing to say that it couldn't happen, that there would be another shortage and then that loophole would open again.
In Omaha, I'm Philip Katafamo, First Alert 6.
Dr. Johnson Rabbit recommends consulting your doctor before trying any of these medications. There could be alternative ways to support your health goals.